I'm Nicole Shanahan, Bobby Kennedy's running mate. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public. I initially saw you where you were talking about your new documentary. Mm-hmm. I later learned that you're 18 years old.
Yes.
Right? And I was blown away with your courage to tackle one of the biggest crises in the world today, which is the skyrocketing cancer rates.
Yeah. 95% of cancers are caused by lifestyle or environmental factors. Foods that had high amounts of added refined sugars, high amounts of chemical additives, preservatives.
You're wanting to kind of inform this new generation that cancer is not a destiny, it's something that can be, actively prevented.
Yeah.
So what are kind of like the cool things we can start cultivating culturally? Is it like the Coachella of farmers markets?
Yes.
Like a farmer's party?
I'm so there.
Well, hi, Grace.
Hi.
So, Grace Price, thank you so much for joining me today. I initially saw you in a news segment where you were talking about your new documentary. Mm-hmm. I later learned that you're 18 years old.
Yes.
You are graduating high school this year. You're from Austin, Texas. And I had a chance to watch your documentary, and I was blown away with your courage to tackle what is one of the biggest crises in the world today, which is the skyrocketing cancer rates.
Yeah.
So tell me, how did you first decide to do this? Like, what was that moment of impetus?
Yeah, I have always had a passion for biology and chemistry, and I'm lucky that my mom is very deep in the health world, so I wasn't foreign to these kinds of things. But when I was in about my sophomore year of high school, after losing my grandfather to cancer, it kind of led me to start asking questions, which is where my research really began. Because I had a lot of thoughts like, well, if my grandpa got cancer, is there any way I could prevent the disease in my lifetime? And is it possible to do that through food or exercise, all these things that I have control over, something more than just kind of genetics or it being a random disease, which is what I think a lot of people believe without even really knowing they believe that. So that's kind of what led me to starting to do all of my own research. Now, I do have to give some credit to my high school that I go to, which is an alternative education school in Austin, Texas called Alpha High. And we have time in the afternoon to pursue super ambitious passion projects because we learn everything in 2 hours in the morning on AI applications. So that's when we do our core subjects. And then in the afternoon, I had time to read all of these scientific papers that I was just so excited by because I was learning all of these new things about there actually being an existent link between food and cancer.
So you were spending your time on PubMed and going into scientifically published papers out of universities. Was there like a specific paper that like really got you on course? Do you remember that aha moment?
Yeah, well, there was one paper that I read, and it basically stated that after assessing, I think it was a meta study, so it kind of assessed a lot of different studies, and what it found is that there are 95% of cancers are caused by lifestyle or environmental factors. And that blew my mind. Yeah. Because I thought surely that would be genetics causing 95%, maybe 5% too. And of course, environment and lifestyle taken together, that's a lot of factors, but they're all things that we really do have a large amount of control over. And most of all, we're not really prioritizing when it comes to healthcare in the US. So that really stuck with me. And I think that's one of the first studies I always show people just because, 95%, that blew my mind.
These research papers are written through a very specific voice. What made you feel confident? You must have been 17 when you read that paper. Like, what made you feel confident in endeavoring into going into, deep scientific research? Because it's almost like its own language.
It very much is. And I will say, I think that because I have access to all of these resources on the internet, I feel very comfortable, utilizing secondhand sources and stuff to actually really make sure I'm understanding a paper. And there's also great AI platforms now just for getting specific papers where it'll tell me how much it's been cited, whether it's statistically significant evidence. Like Consensus is one that I use all the time, and it's
Consensus.
great
Yeah.
for finding just specific things that I was looking for. I found it more helpful than Google Scholar at times. But yeah, I think it was really, I had to teach myself how to do it. So it was kind of like a fail and like relearn kind of process. And what I'm most grateful for is that I was actively building my audience on Twitter, which is now known as X, at the same time. So I was getting great feedback from doctors and dietitians who were like, hey, Grace, maybe look at this. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And I'd take that and then I'd just kind of keep growing.
That's awesome. And yeah, trying to encourage more people to feel comfortable around deep scientific literature would be awesome. So
Yeah.
that's a great pointer you just gave to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that I think people are frustrated with today is this idea that some science is getting weighted more heavily than other science, and especially as it relates to chronic disease.
Yes.
As you're a young, curious person, have you had any experiences trying to understand, what the state of published literature is some published literature slanted one way, and are you
Yeah.
seeing that, or how do you see through that? How do you go through and decipher, if there's any outside influence in certain directions scientists take their work?
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's a really great point you're making because when I first started researching, I definitely wasn't as aware of that. It was more like I just felt as though if I read from both perspectives, then somehow I would find a middle ground and the truth would lie there. Unfortunately, what I found is when I started to actually look at who was funding these studies, and more about the authors and whether there would be any kind of best interest outcome for them, I learned a lot more about confirmation bias and the fact that when it comes to, unfortunately, most nutritional science studies, which is one reason why I think people get so confused when it comes to what to eat because there's conflicting information everywhere. Most studies, they'll say red meat is bad for you, causes a heart attack, but now you have this new slew study saying that's actually not true. You need red meat. And so it's like, what is the truth? And when I started to realize that some of these studies are heavily funded by big food conglomerates that do want to continue to make profit because their products contain maybe some of these ingredients or chemicals. I did a deep dive into aspartame, which is in Diet Coke, and it's like when you
It's a
look
sweetener.
at exactly, it's a non-sugar sweetener, and when you look at these things, it does make sense to me, unfortunately, that what people, wherever the money is, if you follow that, that is kind of going to lead you to also another reason why that is the answer that is most prevalent in the field right now.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us to kind of what the reality is of lifestyle today and what it is we're consuming. I often talk about the moms at the grocery store trying to
Yes.
figure out what to feed their children. And, in your documentary, you highlight how much sugar is in processed foods.
Yeah.
And how that represents such a huge amount of what is being sold in the grocery store. What was your journey coming to this realization like?
Yeah, I think it was the minute that I realized so many foods are processed. I mean, it's basically when you go in a grocery store, every single aisle is processed, and then you go around the perimeter of the store, and that's when you finally get to some real food that our ancestors would have recognized, really. So that's how I started to think of it. And I mean, I just, when I was looking at all of these papers and stuff, it seemed that the most common factor was it was these foods that had high amounts of added refined sugars, high amounts of chemical additives, preservatives, and there was always like 37 ingredients or so. And I started to wonder why we accept that as normal, because being a teen myself, I was consuming these foods every day. Like, Nicole, it was not good. I really was, because that was food to me. So
Yeah.
it's like the definition of food has completely changed for my generation. And so I don't really know how to wake people up to this, because it's hard when that's something you've believed your entire life. And it's something that an entire industry is making billions of dollars off of. I mean, I think it was like the advertisement industry for food and beverage companies spent around like it was either million or billion, but a big amount of money on advertising their products towards kids. And we already know a large amount of those products contain these harmful additives that I talked about. And so when you have them being targeted from that young of an age, it's not surprising that that is kind of just what's abundant around them. So that's what they're going to go towards.
I think, about these kids that just really seek it out because it's so delicious and tasty, but
Yeah.
there's something else going on with that addiction, right?
Yes.
Have you spent much time looking at what's causing that addiction to these foods?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one, unfortunately, does have to do with sugar. And I think that whether you just look at how much our carbohydrate intake has increased over the past couple of years, or just sugar intake as a whole, which has tripled worldwide in the past 50 years. So there's added sugars in everything now, even things that you wouldn't expect, like yogurt, which most people would say, you hear dietitians are like, that's a great source of fat. If you look on the back, there's like 12 grams of sugar in that.
In a tiny cup, right?
A tiny cup. It's
Yeah.
a tiny cup. You don't need that in the morning.
And if you measure out what 12 grams of
Oh my
refined sugar
goodness.
looks like and you
It's
look at
scary.
it, it's startling.
Yes, it is
You would
quite
never
startling.
sprinkle that in your food.
No,
Right?
let alone give it to your kid every time they ask for it. And so I have a lot of sympathy for parents, especially who are just trying to get by and give their kids, what their kids want. I mean, their kids are addicted, so this is what they're asking for all the time. But it's also like there's a willful denial in the community as a whole behind we all are actually very addicted to this, but we're not treating it like we do other addictions. Because if you are interacting with someone who has been a lifetime smoker, you don't just give them a cigarette when they ask for it. You try to help them get better, or even an alcoholic. And I come from a family where we've had a history of people with alcoholism. And I mean, it's very tough, but we don't have any of that when we see our fellow friends, coworkers who have these addictions. We
Right.
instead encourage it. We're like, yeah, live a little, It's very broken the way that we treat that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, AA for recovering
Yep.
alcoholics, but as a society, we don't really have a recovery from addiction to processed foods
No.
and sugars.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, it's actually hard to feed a family whole foods because the
is.
cost of whole foods and inflation is going
Yeah.
up, and really we haven't fostered farm to table as a standard that is owed to the
Yes.
American public. So
Yes.
I think the work you're doing is so important because
Thank
you
you.
are speaking for the young people and you've lived it now. So tell me about your personal experience going from one diet, which is really, this American diet, which no one really talked about as being an
No.
issue,
Yeah.
right? We're just starting to have this
Yeah.
conversation. Tell me about your process of how you went from, one way of living as a teenager,
Yes.
learning what you learned, and then making changes to your own life.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be completely honest with you about this because it's very hard. I was totally addicted to sugar, and I was addicted to it in ways that most people don't even recognize, which is even through fruit. I was eating that all the time, and a lot of tropical fruits especially have super high glycemic indexes and lots of sugar in them. So I was eating all this sugar, and I kind of realized that I needed to start with baby steps. That was how I was going to get my way there. So what I would do is like every Monday or Friday, I would just say no to any kind of bread, basically. And so I started with that. And of course, also that included also like granolas, so I wouldn't have bars and stuff. I just tried to get rid of some of the processed carbs that were in my life. And I would try to just index a lot on protein, healthy fats, nuts, legumes, those kinds of things. So I did that. And I found that on those days, like, it became progressively easier the less I had, which I think is very interesting because it's hard to get people over the first hump. But
Yeah.
now I personally decided that I wanted to go onto the ketogenic diet just because I found that one, it's very aligned with kind of the whole metabolic theory of cancer's origin. So cancer being a metabolic disease, when we have too much of these carbohydrates and stuff, I mean, sugar is very clearly linked to cancer, whether it's through just hyperinsulinemia that's induced by continuous glucose spikes, which we're getting all the time with these foods, or through fructose, actually, which we've seen a lot of new studies on. And Dr. Lustig, he has some incredible work on this. But I mean, when you look at fructose, it basically causes metastases and super aggressive tumors to form because it causes the Warburg effect on these cells, which is where the mitochondria is damaged and the cell falls back onto glycolysis when you have oxygen in the environment, which is very strange. That's not something that our cells are supposed to do. So they are feeding on so much more glucose than normal. And so then the diet just kind of accentuates it. So I found that that's very helpful for me in getting rid of a lot of the sugars, even in places where we don't expect it, like we were talking about earlier in yogurts and juices and stuff. That has helped me commit to it for longer because I don't really have as much of an addiction anymore.
Yeah, your comment on orange juice really
Yeah.
stuck with me because people assume, fruit is actually very healthy for you,
Yes, yeah.
especially if you eat, a naturally grown apple or orange
Yes,
during the
yes.
season.
Mm-hmm.
So our bodies are really designed to metabolize those as healthy sugars.
Definitely.
But what I don't think a lot of people understand is when you go to the grocery store and pick up orange juice, out of the refrigerator, what are they actually getting much of the time?
They are getting loads of sugar. And the worst part of it, though, is there's a lot of fructose in these fruits, which we know, but when you squeeze it into a juice, the fiber is no longer bonded to the sugar. So it completely gets rid of the slowed digestion that you would have when the fiber is bonded to it. And instead, it just causes a massive glucose spike. And in my documentary, I pointed to the example of I was drinking Simply Orange juice every morning, and it was the equivalent amount of sugar as a Coke. But I didn't think of it as that. I was like, it's orange juice. It's healthy,
Yeah.
Nope, I could have just been drinking a Coke every morning.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. So, you have all of these incredible insights now. And one of the things I hear you say in your work is that, this is not an issue of genetics. It's not that you're born with this destiny.
Yeah.
And if you, end up on this life course that ends up in a cancer diagnosis, which is the most terrifying thing you can experience today in our modern world, is to get that diagnosis. It sounds like the message that you're trying to give to people is that it's not your destiny.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Tell me about how you've thought through genetics. I don't think a lot of people understand the difference between genetics and epigenetics.
Yes.
Maybe we can flesh through some of that.
Yeah, no, I would love to. I'm a very big epigenetics nerd, and that's kind of where my love for science started, actually.
How do you define epigenetics as opposed to genetics?
It's a very important distinction, and I think the best way that I could put it in the most oversimplified version is that epigenetics is the light switch that turns a gene on and off. So you have your genes that you're born with, and those are permanent unless we're talking about, gene editing at a young age or something like that. So your DNA is permanent, and you can have things in there that give you increased risk for diseases because we just know that whether it's you get the BRCA gene or you get one for Alzheimer's. But that doesn't mean that the gene is necessarily being expressed. And that means that it's being actively used in affecting your cell. And most of the time, these genes code for specific proteins in the cell. And so when a gene is on, then that gene is active and it's being used. And so epigenetics completely controls which genes are on and off. And what's funny about epigenetics is they are impacted entirely by our environment, whether it's on the intracellular level or external. So everything that we do is impacting our epigenetics, from our thoughts, our stress levels, to how often we exercise, our sleep, all those kinds of things. And our cells are constantly reacting and doing different alterations based off of that. So I don't know if that's kind of answers your question, but that's what I would say.
My daughter was given an autism diagnosis, and we ran all of the top genetics tests at Stanford, and nothing came back conclusive for her diagnosis. In fact, the yields on positives of people with an autism diagnosis that have a genetic marker that will conclusively, oftentimes result in that diagnosis is like less than 1%.
Yeah.
Wow. So now you have, 99% of the population for which it's a mystery, right?
Yes.
Like what's causing this, series of chronic diseases.
Yeah.
So, what I hear from you is epigenetics is this removal from genetics. And it's really looking at, sensitivities.
Yes.
Right. That can be picked up in like a saliva test, but it even is more removed from that. It's just there's, large pockets of populations that are responding to the environment in similar ways.
Yeah.
So kind of let's kind of unpack how you want to take this forward in your own research. When you were looking at epigenetics factors and populations, are you and you're wanting to kind of inform this new generation that cancer is not a destiny, it's something that can be, actively prevented.
Yeah.
So what is your core hope for society today, and how do you think about what you want to do in college and with your career and guiding this forward?
Yeah. I mean, I feel very lucky because I feel like even though what got me onto this path is my kind of frustration with the current system we have in place, I do feel like it is something I want to pursue for at least as long as I am looking forward in my life. And I think that, my goal, I tell people this, but I really think my job is to cut cancer cases in half for my generation. And that the way to do that is to get people to rewrite the narrative when it comes to cancer, that these cancers that are happening in kids, young adults in college, are caused by the food that they're eating, the ultra-processed, sugary-filled foods, and that these foods are the new cigarettes when it comes to the disease. So I like to try to draw a parallel with everything that happened kind of in the past in the 1900s when we had a ton of people smoking. We had scientific research that was supporting the connection between smoking and lung cancer. We sat on that research for about 30 years. We had doctors recommending things like camels and saying oh, it's totally fine. We had the cigarette industry kind of fighting against research. There was a whole
They had a
stage.
huge lobby. It was a profession.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it was
protecting cigarette companies.
We see that very similarly today with these big food companies. And I think that right now we are in the stage where the industry is fighting back against a lot of the things that people like me, I'm only an 18-year-old and I'm just repeating what these incredible scientists and doctors have already said before me. What I'm saying isn't new. My hope is just that I can bring it to my generation so we don't lose millions of lives and waste the next 30 years when we do have enough evidence to at least take a step towards a healthier future. And what I always say is, worst case scenario, maybe these foods have no connection. They are connected to all these other diseases and risk factors in general, where I'm it's gonna make you healthier. So I personally have no issue fighting for that, and honestly just continuing to pursue this research throughout college and get the message out to teens. But it is difficult to get my generation to listen, especially because they're young. So they're like, oh, I don't care. You only live once, whatever. So figuring out how to properly evangelize the message has been difficult, but I'm expanding onto TikTok right now, and building my own app where I'm hoping to encourage teens to just start talking more about their foods. I think that a tragedy too is this whole food shaming trend that's happening right now, because it's very unproductive and causes teens to feel like if they say anything about kind of their health in general, you're stepping into a space where cancel culture exists. And I think it's totally sick for dietitians. A study recently came out that showed that General Mills paid dietitians on TikTok to promote their cereals, which are ultra processed and have added sugars, to say that, well, if you don't agree with us, you are food shaming. And that's totally not okay. You're then limiting free speech while also dietitians, who are the ones supposed to say that we're healthy, telling teens who are unhealthy and struggling with obesity and a wide range of factors, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, things that we've already seen sprung up in them, then being like, oh, okay, I can give in to my cravings. I can eat cereal. That's healthy. It's so broken and really frustrates me.
Yeah. Because, fundamentally, we trust individuals who take that Hippocratic oath.
Yep.
To protect the people they're advising.
Yes.
To do the right thing.
Yes.
And so it kind of leads us to this, strange house of mirrors situation where we don't know who to trust.
Yeah.
And then our platforms, which are so important for free speech, we want the honest truth on those platforms to be able to be the ones that we hear.
Yes.
But then when we have these combating opinions that are backed by huge amount of financial resources, the average person gets conflicting messages.
Yep.
One of the things I admire so much about Generation Z is this desire for the truth, right? It's just something real.
Yeah.
I saw this app where there were no filters, and people were sending pictures of like where they were in that moment with no filter.
Be Real, I think.
I think that.
Okay. Yeah. I love that app.
Yeah. And I was just so amazed that, and so inspired.
Yeah.
By this movement of younger people to seek out like just what's real and unfiltered and, on the theme of unprocessed.
Yes, exactly.
So what are kind of like the cool things that like, we can start cultivating culturally to provide that within the context of this movement for unprocessed foods? Like, is it like the Coachella of farmers markets?
Yes.
Like a farmers party?
I'm so there. I love that idea. I think there's a lot of things. And I mean, one idea that I think would be so cool is we have really great technology now when it comes to tracking things like glucose spikes. So we have glucose monitors that people can wear. We also have things that can measure ketones, all of these different biomarkers that are really helpful when you're trying to actually start committing to a healthier kind of living or lifestyle. And I found that it can be, sometimes people get discouraged really quickly when they don't have the data, because if you don't see change right away, then you're like, oh, it's not working. But I mean, when I track my own biomarkers, I think it's so cool because I'm like, whoa, okay, there are things that are happening right now inside my bloodstream that I'm affecting because of the things I'm eating. So one thing that I think will be a feature on my app is I want to partner with some kind of glucose monitoring company, whether it's Levels or some of the others on the market right now, to do kind of like a nationwide challenge for teens where we basically see who can have the steadiest levels for a long amount of time, and you try to avoid the spike. But I think it's totally what you're saying. It's like making it trendy and cool to be like, yeah, I didn't spike for a whole month. Let's see how we compare. Or I'm going to the farmer's market today where they're selling fresh honey and all these other things, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, you want to come with.
And fresh coconuts.
Yes,
Yeah.
just like bring it to the cities. But yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done in this space that's fun and cool. I've enjoyed it personally.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like such an opportunity to turn something that seems like so scary,
Yes.
and really you know, has been shame based for so long. Like, we got to take the shame out of it.
Take it out of there.
And it can be so enjoyable to live like a fresh, healthy life, right? To go find a river and do like a cool cold plunge and get some sunshine.
It's so great.
And eat some, you know, fresh, like, you know, organic cheeses and crackers and meats. And so, and fruits and vegetables. So yeah, I think I would love to start a farmers party movement with you. If you
Me too. I'm very interested. Let's talk more after.
Yeah, with like great music.
And
you know, I think there's you know, and I want to talk to you more broadly about this. It's really tough being a teenager today, it seems.
Oh my gosh,
I mean, I think about when I was a teenager. In the 90s and early 2000s, it wasn't this hard. Like, it wasn't this hard to be healthy. You know, our cancer rates were a fraction of what they are today. And, you know, as a young woman, like, I was told, you know, I can do anything. I have time. You know, there's like, just enjoy your 20s, you know, don't worry about making money. Go do something that you're passionate about. And I find that like today the pressure seems so high. I mean, tell me about that and like what it's like the reality of it and what it, you know, in your social group. And
I mean, I think that's a very real comment, and it's totally something that, I mean, me and my friends and a lot of people, I think, have had to deal with. It's very strange too, because we've grown up in the age of information. So we have access to everything, which I've loved and utilized well, but we also have social media and these things where that's kind of been a part of our lives for a really long time. And I think it has really affected a lot of females, especially self-esteem when it comes to things. And I think that we all are just very afraid to make mistakes and be wrong. I think that is the biggest thing. And I don't know whether it's cancel culture, whether it's the fact that the education system itself is very broken right now. I think that, I mean, in classrooms, kids are super quiet. They're disengaged. They're basically afraid of the teacher to call on them. When the teacher calls on them, they say kind of what the teacher wants to hear, and that's it. Like, we kind of lost this ability to be free thinkers. And I think as females as well, like that, I don't know, it makes me very sad when I see girls who are kind of afraid to just like be out there and ask questions, and who cares if people think, I don't know, you're weird or annoying. But I don't know. It's kind of strange the way that the culture treats it right now. So yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that makes me feel really sad.
Yeah.
So let's, you know, your name is Grace, and I oftentimes say we got to have a lot of grace right now.
Yeah.
And when I think about the young women today and the young men and, you know, the youth of this country, one of the things that gave me a lot of confidence when I decided to accept Bobby Kennedy's invitation to join him to run as VP was I looked around, and I you know, I looked at Pence, and I looked at Donald Trump, and I looked at, you know, these other individuals like Kamala Harris and Biden. I looked at their backgrounds and where they came up from. And, you know, while like, yes, I have never held political office before, but I have done all of these other things. I said to myself, you know, if Donald Trump can go run for president, I can definitely do this job, right?
I love that.
He didn't have any experience too. And so I think that's the kind of grace we need to give ourselves, is really looking around, and rather than thinking about our own experience as like being under this pressure of constant analysis and criticism, we have to remember that all of the people that came before us, they didn't have the answers.
No.
They were figuring it out as they were going
Exactly.
to.
Yes.
And so, I oftentimes say, like, we have to give each other grace.
Yes.
It's great. It's your name. But we also have to give ourselves that same grace. And I think one of the challenges is that, and I feel this too, I'll call myself out on this, is every time I go to like send a tweet,
Yeah.
right? I like really overthink every
Yes.
word that comes
That's
out.
me
Yes.
too.
Yeah. And so, so kind of what's the exercise that we can go through if we're young in this country and we want to give ourselves some grace? Like, what's like a mental exercise that we can go through when we're going through these moments of just self-criticism?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is something that my dad has helped me a lot with, just as I've grown up. And one thing that I've always kind of done is I'm like, okay, what is the worst case scenario? Like realistically, if I post this tweet and I have a grammatical mistake, for an example, and I think through it, I'm like, okay, maybe there's a guy in my Twitter comments who's like, excuse me, it's actually spelt like this. And that's it. Like that's what happens. And I get so much anxiety about it. And I'm like, well, if that's it, I'm pretty sure I can handle that. Like, I think it's okay.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of imagining, it's really setting perspective, I think, and realizing that even with all of these things, we still live in a country that I believe is a complete blessing to be a part of, that many people from a ton of other places would love to have the opportunity to live in and to be able to just kind of pursue their passion and have a family and all of these different amazing things that the American life has offered many before us. So I think remembering kind of, I guess, how blessed I am to be in this position, and that it's going to be okay. The worst case scenario is almost always not at all life or death. At least in my case, it hasn't been. And so it's really something that I believe I'll be able to kind of figure out. But it is hard getting comfortable with failure.
Right. And
Yeah.
challenge,
Yes.
right? Like, challenge is something that sometimes can feel really scary
Totally.
and frustrating and disheartening when we don't
Yes.
have the answers to perform at the level that either we're being asked to perform at or that we'd like to perform at.
Yeah.
So what is your relationship with challenge?
I, for some reason, have a very natural inclination towards challenging situations. When I was younger, I would always pick like the hardest thing in my math class for some reason, just because I wanted to. Like, my teacher would be like, y'all don't have to do this, but for fun. And I'd be like, I want to do that for homework. So I'd take it home. And I don't know. I think it's like the idea of us having the ability to grow, and that really growth comes from challenge. Otherwise, you're kind of staying the same. That is what motivates me to just challenge myself with big things. And honestly, I also think that you can always think bigger. Like, after releasing my documentary, like, that was great. And I'm so grateful for all the support I've received. But I can't wait to also get it to more people and not stop until my super big dream of seeing like a healthier generation is achieved. And maybe I do or I don't achieve that in my lifetime, but I definitely don't want to stop. And I know that staying the same isn't going to get me any closer.
Well, I think you're well on your way to that goal.
Thank you.
Now tell me about your relationship with failure.
Okay. I mean, I guess I could say I definitely am very, very well aware of a lot of my failures that I've had in the past, and I've come into contact with it quite a bit. I think whether it's in school, I mean, I never was the strongest test taker, so I used to be very insecure about that. The first time I took my AP biology exam, actually, I got a 3 on it instead of a 5. And I know 3 to a lot of people is a good score, but I go to a school where we basically want everyone to get perfect. And so, I mean, that was kind of a really big one for me because that's what I was passionate about. And I had a moment where I was like, do I continue doing this? Maybe I'm really bad at it if I scored so poorly on the test. But then I also realized I was like, well, I also do kind of like get really weird when I take tests. And I know that I was really just like studying for the test. And there's kind of a difference between that and really learning is something that I've kind of realized as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I had to make a decision to, even when I didn't believe I was capable of something, just kind of blindly go into it and keep following what I felt was the right thing.
It's really interesting as I look back on my life. Some of my biggest failures, or what I thought were my biggest failures, actually ended up being my greatest successes.
Yes. Yeah.
When I applied to undergraduate schools, like I didn't have a lot of support from financially. Like I kind of had to
Yeah.
figure it out on my own. Didn't have tutors. Didn't really
Yeah.
have like a counselor. But I thought I was really smart because coming out of my school, I was like, I can go to an Ivy League and
Yeah.
I can get into a great school and or a big UC. I got rejected by all of
Oh.
them.
Oh, that's brutal.
And it actually ended up turning out to be such a success in my life because the schools who did want me were liberal arts colleges.
Amazing.
And they gave me merit scholarships, and they weren't necessarily the schools that everyone wanted to get
Yeah,
into. So it wasn't
sure.
like the Princeton or
Sure.
the UC Berkeley or the Stanford. I was rejected by all three of those. But University of Puget Sound really wanted me, and it's this tiny liberal arts school. And now that we're like kind of looking at the data as to like my generation, who's kind of most well-rounded, grounded in like their passions.
Yes.
Right. Who's pretty healthy,
Yeah.
right? Like who's able to kind of, juggle a family, is pretty happy and content. It turns out that my generation of millennials, those that came from liberal arts colleges, tend to be just happier, more well-rounded
Yeah.
people. Not saying that people that came from the bigger schools aren't, but I think that it takes a lot of the pressure off, right?
Yeah.
And so the things that I ended up going to school, I did get into some UCs, but I ended up picking University of Puget Sound because it had the nation's top ranking arboretum
Oh, wow. There you go.
of like great trees
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and just it was really beautiful. It's up in Washington State. And so I try to encourage people, if you are 17, 18 years old and you're not getting into your first, second, or third choice college, that might be a blessing, right?
Yes.
But how, that's the kind of conversation that I think, I wish I could go in to those homes of those kids when they get those rejection letters
Yeah.
and just give them a big hug and be like,
Oh.
this is not a failure.
Yes.
What are other ways that we can kind of have this conversation, you think, of like, getting to young people in their moment of feeling just utter failure and trying to reach them and say, the most important thing in this moment is your passion,
Yeah.
not what that letter says,
Yeah.
but what you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's the golden goose egg is passion.
I totally agree with you. And I think sharing stories like yours, or I was always really inspired by my mom growing up. And she basically, so she was accepted into UT and had a full scholarship, but she ended up deciding instead to go to a community college because it didn't really work out for her going to college there. But now she created her own Austin deep tissue massage business, which is super successful. She basically grew it from the ground up, but that never would have happened if she didn't go to that smaller college where she then decided to go to massage school, fell in love with anatomy and physiology, and developed her own method that is now scalable. So I think like hearing stories of females especially doing things like that has just inspired me to realize it's really not that important whether you get that kind of virtue signaling of I went to Harvard. If you don't go to Harvard and figure out what you truly find passion and purpose in doing. So, yeah.
I love the story about your mom. And your mom is here.
She is here.
She's lovely. And I oftentimes talk about like, what is a modern day healer?
Yeah.
So tell me about how you think about the modern day healer. Is it somebody who, just guns it for medical school? Is it somebody who, finds a passion in breath work and, these
Yeah.
these alternatives, which I have actually found great healing from.
Yes.
Um, is it all of the above? Is it a personality trait? Like,
Yeah.
does it come from a place of heart? Like, tell me how your views are on healing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I think I would have to go with it's kind of all of the above. I think that there are so many different areas within the realm of like lifestyle and kind of a holistic approach to health, and also just like really, I don't know, enjoying living and improving life quality, that I could see like all of my friends fitting into one specifically. And I think most of all, though, what's unique about my generation that you talked about earlier, we want the truth. We want to, keep it real. We want to know what the real answers are and how to find them. And I think that a lot of us, if we continue to have that personality trait, there will be disruption in a lot of different industries in a good way, where we bring change that I think is needed, and something that hopefully we will all commit to kind of working together just to build a better future. I think that when we look at all of these, I spend all day reading about these depressing things on like colon cancer being diagnosed in 20-year-olds, and it's so disheartening. But then I have to remember that I'm like, there are so many people who care and are fighting for these kinds of things. And that's what inspires me, that people get up every day and feel similarly to me about this issue and are going to continue to try to work towards it. And I really think a lot of the teens in my generation have that fire. So I think that there will be good things to come in the future.
Yay.
Yeah.
Oh, you so inspire me.
Aw.
This has been one of my favorite interviews that I've
I
had.
loved this so much. You're so cool.
You too. Is there anything you would want to share that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've covered almost everything. My last thing I would say is, if you want to continue to follow me on my journey, my username is Traveling Jeans on Twitter with 1G, so it's like Travelin Jeans. And then I'm also on TikTok as well now with that same username. But yeah, go check out the documentary if you want.
Okay, you're amazing, Grace.
You're
we got to bring
awesome.
Grace to the world.